Everyone, we want to welcome you back to yet another edition of our prophecy series, where we dive deep into biblical prophecy to understand how God is going to finish his redemptive work and resolve the issue of sin. In our last session, we began putting some meat on the bones of our understanding of the talking horn mentioned in Daniel 7. And we discussed that an 11th political entity would arise to prominence sometime after 3 of the 10 kingdoms in Western Rome would be uprooted. Now, what I suggested last week is that if we are accurately following the evidence, and I believe we are, then it would make sense for the medieval Roman Catholic Church to be a representation of the talking horn. Heavy emphasis on medieval. If you remember being in high school, I'm sure you remember having a whole section of your world history class dedicated to learning about the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church, the Enlightenment era, and the Renaissance. And we learned about this period because it drastically impacted the culture of our world today. So we too must talk about it because it drastically impacts Christian culture. For instance, Protestant Christianity came out of Catholicism. So you must understand the impact Catholicism has on Christianity, our religious culture, and our reputation. But before we do a deep dive into the medieval church, let's turn back to the book of Daniel because we cover in Daniel 7 and learned about the first vision that Daniel received from God. However, Daniel didn't have clarity on when all these things would come to pass. Matter of fact, at the end of chapter 7, Daniel was left feeling troubled and disturbed. So God revealed a second vision to Daniel 2 years later in chapter 8 that was meant to provide further explanation for things to come. In Daniel 8, we see Daniel have a vision about creatures once again, but this time it's domesticated animals. We focus on a ram and a goat. Now, similar to Daniel 7, the vision doesn't make sense to Daniel and has to be explained to him. In this instance, the angel Gabriel explains that the ram and goat are symbols of 2 empires. He first explains that the ram symbolized Medo-Persia. The 2 horns signify the 2 kings from the Medes and the Persians. Next, Gabriel explains that the goat represents Greece. Now, the goat is unique in that it only has 1 horn rather than your typical 2 horns. So you know that there is something important about that singular horn. And we see this reflected in verse 21 as Gabriel identifies that this horn symbolizes the first king of Greece. Remember, that king was Alexander the Great. Unfortunately, the Greek Empire fell just as quickly as it began due to Alexander's early death. And something that we did not discuss previously is that as a result of this collapse, the empire actually split into 4 kingdoms. Yet, even this is represented in the vision as verse 22 tells us that 4 horns rose after the first horn broke. So a quick Google search will show you that these kingdoms were the Ptolemaic kingdom of Egypt, the Seleucid kingdom in the east, the kingdom of Pergamon in Asia Minor, and Macedon. However, these wouldn't stand too long, as the text tells us another king would rise after these kingdoms fell. Now, these are things that we've gone over before, yet it's important for us to revisit the timeline because chapter 8's vision is supposed to build on chapters 2 and 7's visions. Plus, there's just so much to unpack about the last power. So here's what chapter 8 reveals. First, we see some similarities to chapter 7's descriptions of the talking horn. We see that the final kingdom to arise is represented by a horn that grew out of one of the Greek kingdoms that fell, and that it grew powerfully in all geographical locations. In addition, we're reminded that this final kingdom tried to assume the role of God. For instance, in verse 10, we see that the kingdom grew so much that it could reach the hosts of the heaven. Then we find in verse 11 that the power elevated itself to the level of the prince of the host and took the sacrifices that belonged to the prince. But that's not all. This entity actually took over the sanctuary. And verse 12 shows us that this kingdom stomped on what was truth and essentially created its own truth. Finally, the vision reveals that this will last for 2,300 days. Now, if you're like me, you probably need to take a deep breath. I know that that was a lot, especially since it's all symbolic. But let's take a big deep breath and dive deep into this. First, we must acknowledge that this vision excludes the first and fourth kingdoms that were symbolized by the beast from Daniel 7. This vision only speaks to the Persian Empire, the Greek Empire, and the Talking Horn Empire. And it's important that this is understood because one can easily have difficulty understanding if this vision ends with a discussion about the Roman Empire or the Talking Horn Empire. Yet, the description of this final king in chapter 8 seems to directly fit the description of the talking horn from chapter 7. So let's be clear that it makes the most sense for the end of the vision to be concerned with the talking horn. Next, it's important for us to talk about the God complex of this empire. As I've stated before, each of these empires has a God-sized problem. The problem is that these kingdoms weren't submitting to God's plan, let alone considering what God's plan could be, meaning that each kingdom had an issue with attempting to build an empire and expand that empire without turning to God. Matter of fact, most of the kings who ruled within these empires didn't even acknowledge God. So what we know for certain is that this is, at its root, a sin problem. And remember what sin is. It is life outside of God's direction. So each of these kingdoms and empires has a God complex because they each try to play the role of God in their own way. Now, what's significant about the Talking Horn Empire is that it seems to interact with God's church directly. This is something that we don't see from the prior empires. Yet, Daniel 8 tells us that the last empire disrupts God's work and God's people's actions. What this tells us is that this empire somehow hinders the Christian church, especially since it is taking the offerings meant for the prince, aka Jesus, and redirecting them to itself. So it's skewing the truth and throwing the host, aka believers, off from worshiping God properly. The last piece of information that we'll break down in a later session is the importance and meaning behind the 2,300 days. But for now, we should identify which entity this description seems to fit the most. And based on the evidence that we've collected about it, it makes the most sense to identify the medieval Roman Catholic Church with these descriptions. For one, we've already identified that the Roman Catholic Church succeeded the Roman Empire after 476 AD. And the Roman Catholic Church would essentially become an empire that would expand throughout Europe in all directions. In fact, the empire expanded to the north, the south, the east, and the west, just like the king does in this vision. In addition, the medieval Catholic Church was a religious entity that corrupted the teachings of Scripture. To explain how Daniel 8 speaks to the doctrinal issues of this church, we should look at the symbology a bit more in this chapter. For one, it's important to understand that the symbology focuses on animals that are often used for sacrifices. Rams and goats were common animals used by the children of Israel for the forgiveness of sins. So when the vision begins to identify the misuse of the last empire as corrupting the sanctuary, it becomes clear that this empire somehow impacts how people are being saved. And interestingly enough, the medieval Catholic Church encouraged citizens to pay indulgences for the forgiveness of their sins. As the church became more corrupt, there were religious leaders who even taught that these payments would grant them salvation in the next life. And all of this directly goes against Scripture. So, like the king in the vision, the medieval Catholic Church trampled on the truth of Scripture and created their own truth. And in doing so, the Catholic Empire became a hindrance to the spreading of the true gospel because it was a misrepresentation of God and God's salvation to the world. So if we look pretty clearly, we'll be able to see that the description of the talking horn empire is consistent with the actions of the medieval Catholic Church. And there's more evidence to back this up, which we'll be sure to go over in following sections. But before you go, I wish to reiterate this is history. This has already happened. We're not making any of this up. A simple Google search of the Protestant Reformation will provide you with similar information with which I'm identifying. Yet, the focus of identifying this history is for us to learn from it. So we still have a lot to piece together. So be sure to tune in next time as we attempt to uncover more truth through biblical prophecy. See you next time.